Good morning, and thanks for joining me for this talk, Building Narrative Chat. My name is Doug Valenta. I am a computer programmer based in Portland, Oregon. And I have included this file photo of myself so you can see what I looked like when we all had unlimited haircuts and unlimited moisturizer. I am going to direct questions about and conversation after this talk to the Discord and the question and answer session, the question and answer channel. To begin talking about narrative chat, I need to talk about Mote. Mote is something that I have been working on with my co-creator and my husband for the past 2 years. Mote is an online platform. Players use Mote to tell stories with their friends in real time. And the way that they do that is using a technology that we've created that we call narrative chat. And so what is narrative chat? I am going to show it to you. I have an animation on here that essentially demos it. I want to call out some key concepts about what we're looking at right here that I am going to be stopping during the demo and kind of pointing out, but just to plant these in your mind: chat, emotes, personas, prose, and perspective. So here we have, this is very simple, right? This is a chat message, and it becomes dialogue in a story that we are reading and sort of being told, but also sort of telling. There's another kind of message. It starts with a slash. It's an emote. It's a way for us to say what we do and feel, or rather what our perspective character does and feels. We call this perspective character a persona. It's the person that when we read the story is being referred to as you. There are other people in this story. They have their own personas, and they are also using chat and emotes to say what they do, say, and feel. I want to point out here, as we have more dialogue being added, it nests inside of the existing quotation marks. And as we continue to emote, we can form compound sentences and create quite a rich, high fidelity prose aesthetic. Here's a view of the same story from the perspective of the player whose persona is Alice. They are seeing a different story, although it is kind of the same one, and they are participating just like we were by emoting and chatting. And so this sort of, what we see here is that we're creating a story in real time, and while it has the aesthetics of literature, its politics are quite different. First off, it's obviously a multi-authored work. There's no canonical version of this story. So far, we've already seen 3 very different prose stories here told from different perspectives, one for each of the players in the story. And finally, there's no finished artifact. Creating a final artifact is beside the point. The purpose of narrative chat is to experience and tell the story at the same time, which is actually quite a strange experience, as we've found. So why did we build this? Now, this section is probably the portion of this talk that has changed the most over the past couple of days. Originally here, I had something that I was having a hard time writing and that I was having a hard time presenting and getting excited about. It was sort of this story about a design journey and design thinking and having clearly defined brand values. It was sort of about this sort of utopian idea of technology and design and user experience. And I think that story, that it kind of exists. It's kind of true. And there is a story maybe to tell there, but it's not the real reason why we ended up building this. If you go back 2 years ago, what we wanted to do, this original idea, this original like impetus for us to start working on something that ended up evolving into Mote, was that we wanted to create an online platform for essentially MUDs. Both of us had grown up playing MUDs, playing interactive fiction, and text adventures, and wanted to create a sort of modern online platform that could capture that experience, but also make it more. Like, what could we do with more modern technology and more modern thinking behind that? And I think that one part of this that I know talked about a lot at the beginning and still talk about this to this day, was that we wanted this to be a way that players could express themselves and construct identities inside of a universe. I think that for both of us as queer people, this was a very important part of this project that we probably didn't talk about enough before we sort of had some realizations. So as we kind of set out to build this, we have this sort of thing here, this sort of this like core user interface of the classical MUD or text adventure, which is just this blank line where you're invited and welcome to write something, to share something, to tell what happens in a world that you are engaged with. And behind this user interface is a piece of technology, a parser that reads what you wrote. And what I realized as I was beginning to develop this piece of technology was that the parser's goal seemed more and more to be to find more and more reasons why I could tell a person that what they had said was wrong. What they had said about this world that they were in was wrong. Why what they had said about themselves was wrong. The sort of classic phrase, although I don't have a real reference for it, you can't do that here. And this didn't sit well with me. And I think it took a little while, maybe a couple of weeks, for me to really wrap my head around the amount of discomfort that I was feeling with this idea that I was creating a technology whose job seemed to be to regulate people and their expression, and their expression of themselves and their identity. And I started to see that there was sort of this relationship that computer games really create between machines and people, where the person here on the bottom is the player, and the machine, the game, is sort of telling them what is possible and enforcing rules upon them. I think that we could add another person to this diagram. This person might be the author or the designer of a game, and they tell the machine what to do, but what they tell the machine to do is how to control the activities of another person. And this sort of diagram, I would say, is sort of not, for me, the kind of relationship that I'd like to see between people and machines in this world. And we can see here that the machine has actually become a vector for one person to dominate another person. And there is another way for us to have a relationship with machines, and this kind of a relationship with a machine, where the machine is mediating an interaction between two people, mediating play between two people, augmenting two people's interactions with one another, is something that we see in tabletop games. This is how the technology of a tabletop game works. The tabletop game doesn't bound what the players can do with it, although it does contain some suggestions. Ultimately, the players use the game to play with one another. And it ultimately became what we wanted to be able to create as the relationship between players using the technology that we were going to create. I think that there is something to be seen here. I don't want to say that computer games are bad, but I think that there is something to be seen here where computer games take the idea of a game, which has rules, and the first thing that they do with those rules is they hide those rules away from view. They place them inside of the computer, and they also expand them vastly to proportions that can't always be kind of worked out by the human mind, right? The rules of computer games need to be able to be enforced by computers, not by humans. They don't even always need to be communicated to the humans that are playing the games. And the other thing that computer games do is that they turn rules into physics. there's, you know, the old saying that you need to know the rules before you can break them. But computer games take away both of those possibilities often for players, both the ability to know rules and also the ability to break rules. There's a way in which computer games make rules something that cannot be fudged, something that cannot be broken, something that cannot be played with or explored. And in this sense, and also take something that was once exposed and hides it away. And in this sense, I'd say that computer games are very unqueer. And so there I go with my incendiary remarks. So why am I here? I think that text is important. I don't probably need to sell that to this crowd very strongly, but I think that like text in its ability to be a way for so many people to communicate so much, so richly, is a very important medium for us to continue to explore and uplift, as opposed to the constant cavalcade of new graphical technologies that seem to make the creation of expression more and more distant from your average person being able to, you know, create photorealistic AAA VR graphics, for example. I also have discovered along this journey the incredible power of asking people to pretend, of instructing people to pretend, of taking the responsibility for maintaining some kind of internal simulation and world and physics from a computer and handing it back to human beings who are used to doing this thing. We do it when we read fiction, right? Of being able to imagine a world and also being able to pretend and come up with our own ideas of what can happen inside of that fictional space. And finally, it's a call to action. I think what I've learned most out of this process, and even out of the process of preparing this talk, is how much room there is for technological innovation when it comes to interactive, parametric, generated, and user-created text-based narratives. And so, without further ado, I'll start getting into how narrative chat works under the hood. Now, this section is quite complex, and I have tried to give an overview. I couldn't probably possibly explain it all in the time that I have. So if there's anything that you have questions about, please ask. I will say that it sort of took us probably 3 months to have the realizations that I described in the previous section, and another maybe 3 or 4 months to build the original prototype of narrative chat. And we spent probably the next 1.5 years figuring out what it was for, and thus figuring out what Mote was for. So while I started the talk by telling what Mote was for, and then telling what it was, this was a real journey and a real process for us. So I'm gonna start by talking about how narrative chat does not work. So when I first looked at this problem, this idea of like someone enters an emote, and my goal is not to decide whether or not it can happen, but instead, like I would like a mud command, but instead to, or even to enact it. But my job is to really narrate it. My job is to narrate it, and I want to narrate it from multiple perspectives. I want everyone in the room to be able to see it and read it from their own persona's perspective. And I had been working on a lot of sort of like procedurally generated text projects and things like that. And I sort of naturally started to see this problem as essentially a string manipulation problem, essentially a problem that I might be able to solve with templates. I basically want to be able to take this string and turn it into these 2 other strings. And so if I'm to do that, I can sort of, you know, block out these sections that are going to need to be templatized and parameterized based on whether I am creating a string to show to the person who originally entered the emote or to everyone else, people who are not the actor. And so we can kind of just like see how this kind of breaks out. We can do some very simple string processing to try to fix, you know, punctuation and capitalization and produce 2 versions of this string, voila. And this is not, in the end, how narrative chat works. There are several reasons why this didn't work. First of all, it doesn't scale well beyond 2 players. When you have multiple people in the room, and especially when when people can mention each other in their own emotes, you start to get a lot of complexity there in terms of how many different versions of the string you need to make. Punctuation in prose is much more complex than adding a period at the end of a sentence. Every new feature I added, it felt like I had introduced a new weird whitespace bug, and probably like half my code was around trying to preserve and move around whitespace in between words. And finally was this kind of realization that I probably hit on the wrong model. Even though it's just like a name, like we think about templates as something that you're going to use over and over again. That's why you make a template. And in this case, the templates were never reused. So maybe thinking about this as templates was wrong. And what I realized coming out of this was that so many of our tools for creating interactive narratives and for telling interactive or dynamic stories are actually tools for manipulating strings in fancier and fancier ways. And they're, because of that, they're operating on this on the character level, a string of characters. And I had this idea that was really motivated by the idea of creating a chat experience that could create a cohesive prose story. That there was this process there that deserved to have technology and abstraction really thrown at it to try to build up this capability to narrate stories, that the narration itself, the rendering of actions and dialogue in a story into prose was a concern unto itself that was going to require some technology behind it. And so what that came to look like was parsing player input to try to interpret the player's intent, narrating that intent into action and dialogue in a story, and finally rendering it into prose. And I am going to walk through all 3 of these sections and kind of talk about how we have approached it so far. So to begin with, parsing. Classically, parsing is about taking strings of characters and converting them into tokens. And classically, in a MUD or an IF, our goal of parsing user input is to understand what the user means. What are you referring to? What are you trying to do? And is that allowed? And this is where immediately our technology began to diverge from the technology behind these other experiences, which is that our parser's goal was to answer the question, how do you mean? And what I mean by that is, how does this string of characters come to mean something to you as a human being, and to mean something that you would like to communicate to other human beings? Our goal isn't to decide whether you can mean that thing, only how do you mean it, so that we can facilitate, so that we can augment. And this is in linguistics, the distinction sort of between semantics and syntax, where semantics concerns itself with the meaning of words and phrases and how those words and phrases come to mean, and syntax concerns itself more with how they actually operate together and how they interact together to begin to produce semantic meaning. And so, as I said, the sort of parsing process typically starts by breaking a string of characters into, basically, we're trying to create more and more abstract structures to represent whatever this is that is in this string, right? And I provided a little bit of a more complex example here so that we have a lot to chew through together. But we'll start with this one, /slip at Alice's secret note in my pocket. There's a lot going on here. And so the first thing that we need to do is break this up into tokens. And this is more or less what the tokens look like that Mote's narrative chat implementation uses to break down this emote. And the 2 colors here represent kind of two big kinds of tokens. One of them is that at reference, and that's like, you know, it's an at mention, like on Twitter, right? Whereas the gray ones are textons, and these textons we break out into a bunch of groups. But suffice to say, like, textons are going to be the building blocks of what we're going to end up rendering, right? And the textons we divide into these groups, and that to give them different properties and be able to process them in different ways, as we're going to see moving down the line. But basically, these are kind of the building blocks of our narrative. Now, not all of the textons that we see here already broken out are what are going to end up in the final output, but they are in that class of token, right? So our next step is that we want to be able to interpret these tokens and try to assign them meaning. And that's not a semantic meaning. That meaning, we're not trying to figure out what does it mean to slip a note into a pocket, and how does that affect the relationship between a note and a pocket, and is that allowed? But rather, we're trying to understand the syntax, how these tokens participate in the syntax of what this person who wrote this emote is trying to say, and what they're trying to add to a story. So, you know, to begin with, we have slip, and we know that that's a verb, right? And so we can classify that as a verb. Here we can take these two tokens, at Alice and the apostrophe S clitic, which is marking the possessive, we'll assume. And we can turn that into a reference to at Alice in the form of a determiner. And we can actually do the same thing here with the token my. Even though my was a texton, we know that it's really a way for the person writing the emote to refer to themselves. And so they're referring to themselves in the determiner form. And what does that mean for a reference to have a form? Well, what I'm talking about are nominal forms. There are 5 nominal forms in English. They aren't quite cases. Some of them are cases, some of them are not. They are the subjective, the objective, the possessive, the determiner form, and the reflexive. And we can see those illustrated really clearly when we look at a noun like the first person pronoun, right? So this is the same word, but it takes different forms depending on what role it's playing in the sentence. A wonderful thing about the first person pronoun is that it takes a distinct form based on which role is playing in the sentence. So we can always detect what form the first person pronoun is in just by looking at it. Many of our pronouns don't do this. He and she both have forms that are reused across 2 of the forms. It varies very little across different forms. We have it, its, and itself. But first person pronoun, they, and also we are wonderful in this way, that they are it's very clear when you look at them what they are. And so here we have a determiner. Determiner is like my. It's like I said, it's kind of like a case, and it's kind of not. It turns this word into really an adjective in English, or into a determiner, which is like what the and this are, right? And so we have these references now, but what are they referring to? They must refer to something, and for us, this thing that they refer to, we call it topic. And a topic is basically a thing that can be referred to. It's something that can be the subject of a sentence. It has a name. It has a pronoun it can be referred to by. I have gone too quickly. It has a pronoun it can be referred to by. And I want to call out here a prominent example of a topic, and really the only kind of topic that we will see today is a persona. So a player's persona is a topic. So now that we have completed parsing this, we're ready to narrate it. And we can think of the overall goal of narration as being to turn this thing that we've created back into a sequence of textons. And we're going to perform narration independently for every player that is reading the story. And so before we can do that, we need to think about the current state of the story itself. We're going to be adding whatever we render to a story that's live. It's an alive story, a living story, and we're going to have to add it and integrate it some way with the prose that has already been written. And we call the way that a piece of narration is going to get integrated with existing prose, its disposition. And we need to determine the disposition so that we really understand how to handle it in the rest of the narration process. So we have basically 3 different dispositions that a piece of narration can have. One is the break. The break is where this piece of narration is going to begin a new paragraph. Another one is the inline disposition, that being it's going to be a new sentence added to an existing paragraph. And then finally, we have a continuation disposition, which, as we looked at before, we use in 2 sort of different places, but they work similarly very far down the pipeline, which are, first off, when we're adding new dialogue to an existing quotation, and also when we are adding a fragment of a sentence to an existing sentence to turn that into a compound sentence. So for the purpose of this example, we're going to pick the simplest option. How to pick these is sort of a great question. There's no one right answer to do it. You know, we have an algorithm that we have been able to continue to iterate on. That's been one of the wonderful things about this technological architecture, has been to be able to turn a lot of these problems into something that you kind of solve in one place in a stupid way that works 90% of the time, and then just kind of keep improving it and kind of keep coming up with new ideas of, you know, pieces of context that you could use to hint you in the right direction. So if this is going to be the first sentence after a break, and I've cut out all of the textins that aren't all of the things other than references and verbs just for now, so that we can just see what we're working with in this inflection phase of narration. We're kind of missing something to make this a complete sentence. We need something before the verb to make this a sentence, and that's a subject for the sentence. And that's turns out to be pretty easy to make now in this context, because we know that the subject of the sentence is going to be the persona of the player who wrote the mote. And so we know that that's the topic that is going to be the subject of the sentence, and we know that the form of that reference is going to be subjective. And so inflection is a word from linguistics. You might know it as conjugation when it applies to verbs, but it applies to all different kinds of words, and is a way that words or lexemes are marked morphologically for different grammatical purposes. And so we basically are going to need to perform different transformations on these things in order to tell the story from multiple perspectives. And the big crux of telling the story from multiple perspectives is going to be inflection. And so the first thing we need to do is we need to turn these references to topics into nouns. And there are 2 real phenomena that are going to guide how we do that. They have fancy names, but they're pretty simple. The first one is parallax, and by parallax here, I basically just mean that the reader of the story, and like I said, we're going to do this separately for each reader, the reader of the story is going to be referred to as you. And then we have anaphora, and anaphora essentially just means that we're going to refer to, when we refer to people by name, after that, we're going to refer to them by a pronoun. And so the pronoun can be in a way where the pronoun will be able to infer the antecedent of the pronoun from the context. In a simple sentence like this, it's going to be pretty simple. So we can start off, and let's just say that we're doing this for the player who is at Alice, in which case that reference to at Alice is really going to be a reference to the pronoun you. And then let's say that we've got Bob here, and Bob is the one who wrote the emote. And so Bob is the persona of the player who wrote the emote. And so we can resolve the first reference to Bob to a name, and the second reference to Bob as a pronoun. Now, we still don't have textins. We need to turn these into textins, but luckily nouns are something that we can turn into textins. In order to do that, we're going to be selecting a textin based on the form of the reference. So we can see here these nominal forms extended out to the kinds of different nouns that we're working with in this emote. And we've got Bob in the subjective, we've got your in the determiner, and we've got his in the determiner. And so all we need to do is bring in these texts to replace these references, and ta-da, we're done. Now, one important thing about why we did the nouns first is that the way that we conjugate the verb is going to be dependent on the noun that we used as the subject, not on the textin that we used as the subject, and not as on the topic that we used as the subject, but on the noun. Those nouns, remember, have these properties attached to them, a person and a number. And in English, we have something called subject-verb agreement, where the verb is inflected to agree with the subject. And what that means is it needs to agree with the person and number of the subject. I'll also point out here that, for example, when we're working with, personas or topics that are singular but use a they pronoun, then in that case, their pronoun has a different number than their name. And so it's very important to know when we're conjugating the verb, whether the subject of the verb is their name or their pronoun, because it can make a big difference in which verb that we use. So how do we use this information to actually pick a text in for the verb? I can tell you right now that we have the wrong text in here, which is the text in that came from original parsing. Bob, slip your secret note. So to figure this out, we need to stop and talk about verbs for a second. How do verbs work in English? In English, we have 5 verbal forms, just like we have 5 nominal forms. They don't really map really pleasantly to tenses or anything like that. So they have these wonky names, but basically we have a base form, which is like go. We have an S form, which is like goes. We have a past form, which in the case of go would be went. We have a past participle form, which in the case of go is gone. We can use it to describe something that previously went. And then we have an ing form that we use to form the gerund, as well as we can kind of turn it into a noun. We can use it to turn the verb into an adjective. And so in this case, we have a simpler verb. We have a regular verb. We have the verb slip. And what I mean by it's a regular verb is that really these 5 forms are from the base, pretty simple to come up with. Where the S form adds an S, the past and participle both add ED, and the ing form adds ing. And so I spent a lot of time worrying about irregular verbs. And there are a lot of irregular verbs in English. One thing to know about irregular verbs in English is, first of all, they're all irregular in this past and participle form. And irregular verbs in English are all very old. They are from before we started having regular verbs. When we add new verbs to English, they are always regular. And over time, the irregular verbs are becoming regular. And we can see this happen all the time with different verbs over time, right? And so the first thing to realize is that, like, these irregular verbs, they're a closed set, and you also know them very well. That's why they're still irregular. The reason that go is such an irregular verb is because nobody who is a fluent English speaker ever forgets to say went instead of goed. Maybe someday in the future they will, but I find that highly unlikely. So some of these are probably here with us to stay, but other of them, like sneaked versus snuck, we can see already sort of appearing in multiple forms in the world. And the other thing is that we aren't actually needing to use those forms. So we are trying to conjugate this verb for the simple present tense. And that means that we only care about the base and the S forms. And in the base and the S forms, English verbs are highly regular. Here are some examples of different verbs with different sort of endings to the base word and how those sort of play out in the S form. They're not perfectly regular. It's not just add the character S to the end, but we're always adding S, ES, or SES, and this ends up being relatively simple to put together and to test code that handles this. There are 2 verbs in English that are not regular in the S form. You hard code them. So there we have it, our base and our S forms of the verb. Now, how do we know which one of these to use? And the answer comes from the person and the number. We use the base form of the verb in the simple present tense when the subject is in the second person or is plural in number. And we use the S form when the subject is third person and singular in number. But I don't remember which one we needed at this point. What was it? Oh yeah, it was Bob, third person singular. So here we go, slips. Congratulations, we finally inflected this sentence. Luckily, the computer does it much, much, much faster. So the final step here we call rendering, and rendering encompasses a wide variety of maybe seemingly unrelated activities, but the common thread is that these are all things that we can do just to the textins without really having to know very much at all about how they're being used. We basically just need the textins and the disposition of the narration to be able to perform these processes on them. And I'm only really going to look at two of them this morning. Capitalization is essentially very, very trivial. And the other two, applying styling and encoding them to actually be rendered by whatever it is actually putting the pros in front of people, are sort of implementation dependent, about a bit out of scope for today. But we're going to talk about healing punctuation and adding white space. So when we talk about punctuation, we're talking about these punctuation characters. And notice I don't have like every punctuation character here. My goal is to represent prose and represent parts of stories. I'm not worrying about things that are weird. I'm making a best effort, right? So why do we need to heal this punctuation? There are a few reasons. I mean, first of all, players make typos and we want to make them look good. And another reason is that it allows us the opportunity to be able to flow together things that come from different sources that aren't necessarily designed to go together. Even, for example, if somebody had a name of their persona, which is a user-defined text that contained punctuation, we would still want it to play right with the punctuation in the sentence. And this also frees us up if we're using this system to flow in pre-authored content or procedurally generated content. That content doesn't need to be authored to work together perfectly at the character level. So we kind of divide this punctuation into three groups. We can talk about terminal punctuation, which is the stuff that goes at the end of the sentence. Phrasing punctuation, which is the stuff that goes in between words of a sentence, and then grouping punctuation, which just is like a little bit special. We don't do a ton of special handling for those, but basically we have some rules, right? And these are, these are the kind of rules that are made to be broken. These are essentially style decisions that we have encoded and that could evolve over time. But basically, we have this idea that the phrasing punctuation mark, we shouldn't have more than one in between any two words, right? And so our solution to that is basically we select one of the, if there are multiple punctuation marks between words, we select one of them based on an order of precedence. And I can kind of just sum that up to say we just pick the most interesting punctuation mark. And here they are actually in their order of precedence. So if we have a dash and then a comma in between two words, we will remove the comma and only keep the dash. The ellipsis and the dash are a little special because we can also allow those at the end of a sentence. And if they are if they do come after the final word, basically none of those phrasing punctuation marks other than these are allowed after the final word of the sentence, but these are, and if they're there, they're going to come before any exclamation point or question mark that we also have in the sentence. And those are going to go at the end of the sentence. And then finally, if we don't have any punctuation at the end of the sentence, then and only then do we need to actually add a period to the sentence. Like I said earlier, punctuation is a bit more complex than just adding a period at the end. It turns out to be the fall through case. Quotation marks, you want to put the punctuation on the left side of the quotation marks, and with parens, you want to put it on the outside of the parens. Yeah, you can have punctuation inside parens in real life. This is, as I said, just how we handle it. White space. So we've got these tokens, but there's no like space token, right? And if there were, we would probably end up with like space tokens next to each other, accidentally deleting the space token in between words. Like I said, my initial efforts at this were riddled with white space bugs. So we actually completely have removed white space through all of the processing so far. And now when we render, we're going to have to add it back in. And so we basically have this rule for every kind of textin. We have a rule applied to it that says whether it wants white space before and whether it wants white space after. And whenever we have two textins next to ext other, if the first textin wants white space before and the second textin wants white space, sorry, if the first textin wants space after and the second textin wants space before, then we put a space. Otherwise, we don't. That's why when you have a word followed by a clitic, you will not have space in between the word and the clitic, because the clitic doesn't want white space before. People who don't want white space win. So for us, this is just a quick sample of encoding. This is more or less what the output of our actual narration engine is. It is JSON. It has a disposition. It's going to tag who the player is who created this this emote to begin with, and it's going to include an HTML version of the printed emote. In this case, we don't have any tags, but this is where we would allow, for example, things like emphasis marks. We allow players to emphasize words by placing asterisks around them, and those would be represented here as HTML tags. So what did we learn? And I actually like to call this section what surprised us. The first thing that we came across after building this insane thing, this crazy person system, is something that we came to refer to as the Uncanny Editor. The Uncanny Editor basically refers to this sense of the uncanny that we began to experience as we were using it. Even though we understood how it worked, even though we were providing all of the input into the story, we found that we were always being surprised by what appeared in front of us. And so that's what we started to call it. I think that it may be related to the sensation of reading. When we read, we have this sensation that people often refer to as being transported, where we're reading the book, and the book is basically putting ideas into our mind, and it's kind of hot-wired into our imagination. And we are producing this imagined version of the story in the book inside our minds. Even when we put down the book, that imagined version might keep continuing. And with something like Mote, there's a weird mixing where we're also using our imagination, and we are now pretending, and we are adding to the story itself. And there becomes this sort of cycle between what we read and our minds, and the way that we're trained to treat stories that look like Mote stories do. Another thing that surprised us was this phrase, "I'm afraid of what I might do." I actually have this printed out over my desk. This is something that a player in an early playtest said to us as she stared at the computer screen with her fingers poised above the keyboard. This sense that players seem to get that it matters what they do. I think it's a sense that they have real, true power and ability to do things, to make things real. You know, we've sort of tied it to the idea of sort of aporia and epiphany that you know is talked about in the cybertext world, but also to this idea of more of a almost like a sense of paralysis that we found to be really fascinating. Finally, what I was surprised by was that it was worth it. It seemed like a huge amount of technology and abstraction to throw at this kind of what I suppose I had been trained by the world to believe was a very simple problem. We needed it because we were creating this thing that was we had this idea for narrative chat, and we wanted to bring it to life. And so we needed to build this technology to do it. But after we did that, and especially while I was preparing this talk, I was able to spend some time reflecting on what we had done, on what this technology was. And I had this kind of realization and this vision of this idea of treating narration itself as a process that is worthy of having technology invested in it, of taking stories wherever they come from, whether like with narrative chat, they come from players themselves, or whether they come from dynamic systems that are generating stories and actions, or whether they are coming from pre-authored content that's being combined with that, and being able to present them as cohesive prose is a class of technology that is worth exploring and continuing to build for our games. I'm which kind of leads me into my final section, which is I want to talk really briefly about graphics. Like, this is how graphics work. And there was a time when graphics didn't work this way. When the idea was that, well, we have graphics and we're going to blip them to the screen. And now, for the past 20 years, more or less, this is how game graphics have worked, is that there are these abstractions about things that could be graphical, things like cameras and materials and geometry. And they go into this pipeline that processes them and turns them into actual images for people to see. And I have this vision of a similar technology for prose. That's called a programmable graphics pipeline. And I think about this as a programmable prose pipeline. What would it mean for our games if we had the ability to operate on narratives and narrative material in the abstract sense of action and dialogue, of perspectives, narrators, settings, and characters, and have technology be able to augment and assist with transforming those abstract representations of narrative into stories that players can read, and stories that are alive and evolve over time, and that players are able to interact with and truly play with. Thank you. Thank you for joining me today. That's all I got. I am Doug. You can find me on Twitter at Doug Valenta. If you are interested in Mote, you can find us on Twitter at Mote_chat and at whatismote.com. I said it in the Project Hype channel the other day, but if you missed it, we are currently in closed beta, but we are actively recruiting people to lead beta groups. So if you have a group of 3 to 7 friends who are interested in trying Mote with us, I would love to talk to you. I am going to be taking questions in the Discord and the question and answer channel. Thank you very much for being with me here today.